Mr Veli devoted much of his life to maintaining the graves and monuments of Commonwealth soldiers that mark the landscape of the place he calls home, Gallipoli. Small, wizened, with a back bent from decades of hard labour, Mr Veli lives a quiet existence in the town of Ekabat, unnoticed except perhaps as a curiosity by the thousands of Australian tourists who make the pilgrimage to the very graves he tends. He began working for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission around 1960. Uncertain of the actual year, as his lack of education means he marks the passage of time with events, not dates. He says he retired at the start of the First Gulf War. Initially, he made the 13-kilometre trek across the island on the back of a donkey. 3 motorbikes followed, all eventually broken by the rugged paths as Mr Veli set about the work of keeping the graves of Gallipoli safe. The peninsula then was a far cry from the busy, well-manicured place it is today. The monuments are the same, and in their presence he becomes animated, explaining how he worked the stone by hand, replacing worn steps, removing cracked stones and building walls. At the beach cemetery, the resting place of John Simpson, moving surprisingly freely for his age, Mr Veli walks among the graves, smiling slightly and bending down to touch a tombstone. We used to always make sure they had lined up straight. We had to get it perfectly right or else we'd get fired, he said with a smile, when talking about cutting cracked stones out and replacing them. And he obviously did get it right, as the medal honouring his 27 years of service with the CWGC can attest. It's bronze, not gold, but I like it that way. Otherwise someone in my family would have tried to sell it by now, he said. His time with the CWGC included a trip to Libya to maintain Allied World War II graves during the time of the Iraq-Iran War, and up to Istanbul, home of the graves of British dead from the Crimean War, although he says that was only because he was cheap. Another medal, presented by former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, hangs on the wall of his house, the unlikely meeting of a Turkish villager and a 20th century icon, unsurprising in this part of the world. At the mention of Australians, one former boss, Jeffrey, stands out in Mr Veli's memory. Australians, they like to laugh. The British, they're too stiff for the Turkish, he said. The people of the Gallipoli region are a living legacy of great events intruding on a quiet corner of the world, forced custodians of Australia's foundation myth. But Mr Veli is happy to see the tourists come. They have made life on the peninsula much better. We hope that a war like this will never exist again. But there is a bond between our countries now. The memorials gave Mr Veli a steady job, an opportunity to work hard and be rewarded for that work. A legacy that continues to this day, with his nephew working for the CWGC as a gardener. Mr Veli says, if you're tired, sleep. If you're sick, go to a doctor. If you're well, go to work. Today's generation of Turks live in a global world, connected to the internet. They know all about Australia. Mr Veli has no such connections, but even so, the question of who these soldiers were and why they matter enough for people to still visit a century on doesn't faze him. There's a temptation to ascribe wisdom to age. But when he talks about what brings Australians to this faraway part of the world, he says, they're here to honour their dead. If our sons were buried far away, we would make the same journey. In his working days, Mr Veli's only regret was seeing the Turkish dead would not afford the same honour. The construction of graves and monuments for the more than 85,000 Turkish soldiers who lost their lives in the 9-month conflict lagged far behind those of the Commonwealth. All this has changed. Now monuments to the Turkish fallen command the heights just as proudly as those of their former enemies. Gallipoli today is big business. Every year millions of Turkish pilgrims mix with those here to honour the Anzacs, with a steady stream of tour buses transporting people from site to site. But thankfully, for now at least, the peninsula remains relatively unspoilt. The graves and memorials are washed with the colour of spring flowers, beautiful, picturesque spaces that belie their bloody history. In these places, the presence of the fallen soldiers is tangible, and there is merit in dwelling for a moment on the people who have cared so well for them, lest we forget.